Sometimes the smallest acts of mercy can change the course of a man's entire life. In a world where compassion was seen as weakness, one Viking warrior was about to discover that true strength comes from the most unexpected places. Erik Ironwood was a feared chieftain in 9th century Norway, where survival meant being ruthless and honor meant everything. After a successful raid in distant lands, he returned home with gold, weapons, and slaves. Among them was Mei Lin, a young Chinese woman he bought at auction for 3 silver coins. She was supposed to work his fields until she died. Nothing more. But as the harsh Norwegian winter set in and enemies gathered at his borders, something began to change. The quiet strength he saw in her eyes and the wisdom in her words started touching something deep within his warrior's heart. What? Could make a Viking risk everything for a foreign slave? Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from. And if this story moves you, subscribe, because tomorrow brings something extraordinary. The fjords of Norway stretched like ancient scars across the earth, their dark waters reflecting the pewter sky of early winter. Here, where the sea met the mountains in a dance as old as time itself, Erik Ironwood had built his legacy. His longhouse stood like a wooden fortress against the elements, its carved dragon heads facing the horizon where enemy ships might appear. The smoke rising from its central hearth spoke of warmth, prosperity, and the hard-won peace that only strength could maintain. Erik's father's battle axe hung above the great hall's entrance, its iron blade still sharp despite the years since. Thorvald Ironwood had wielded it in his final battle. The weapon served as both decoration and reminder, a symbol of the warrior code that had shaped 3 generations of chieftains. Every morning, Erik would pause beneath it, feeling the weight of expectation that came with leadership. His father had died defending these lands, and Erik had spent the last 15 years proving himself worthy of that sacrifice. The settlement bustled with the controlled chaos of preparation. Winter was coming, as it always did, and survival depended on readiness. Women worked at looms, creating the thick wool that would keep families warm through the darkest months. Children helped where they could, learning the skills that would one day make them valuable members of the community. Men repaired boats, sharpened weapons, and discussed the rumors that drifted down from the northern settlements like smoke on the wind. Bjorn Ironwood, Erik's younger brother by 3 years, emerged from the armory with his usual purposeful stride. Where Erik was measured and thoughtful, Bjorn was quick to anger and quicker to action. The brothers complemented each other well, Erik's wisdom tempering Bjorn's passion, Bjorn's fire warming Erik's sometimes cold calculations. "The new slaves are settling in," Bjorn reported, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. "The Saxons seem strong enough for the heavy work. The girl from the eastern lands, though she's small, won't last the winter if we work her like the others." Erik nodded, though something in his chest tightened at the casual dismissal. He had noticed Mei Lin during the long journey home, the way she had endured hardships that broke stronger men. There was something different about her, something that spoke of hidden depths beneath the surface of apparent fragility. Put her in the kitchens, Erik decided. At least there she'd stay warm. The slave quarters occupied a series of small buildings near the main settlement, practical structures that provided basic shelter without luxury. Erik had built them himself after becoming chieftain, believing that even the lowest members of their society deserved protection from the elements. Some of his peers thought this made him soft, but Erik had learned that desperate people were dangerous people, and content workers were productive workers. As evening approached, Erik found himself walking past the slave quarters more often than usual. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, he could see Mei Lin sitting quietly in a corner, her dark hair catching the flickering light of the small fire. Unlike the other captives who huddled together for warmth and comfort, she sat alone, her posture straight despite her exhaustion. She seemed to be studying everything around her with the careful attention of someone who understood that knowledge meant survival. The other slaves had already formed the alliances and hierarchies that emerged in any group of people forced together by circumstance. But Mei Lin remained apart, not from arrogance or fear, but from a kind of watchful patience that reminded Erik of a cat observing its surroundings before deciding where to make its home. That night, as snow began to dust the settlement's rooftops, Erik sat in his great hall listening to the reports from his advisors. Gunnar Bloodaxe's name came up repeatedly, as it had for months. The rival chieftain controlled territory to the north, and his ambitions had been growing along with his army. Raids against Erik's outlying farms had become more frequent, more brazen. War was coming, as surely as winter was coming, and Erik needed to be ready. Astrid, the settlement's eldest woman and Erik's most trusted advisor, warmed her hands over the fire as she spoke. The northern farmers brought news today. Gunnar's been recruiting mercenaries from Denmark. His forces have nearly doubled since spring. Let him gather all the warriors he wants, Bjorn growled. When they come, we'll be ready. Our men know this land, and they know what they're fighting for. Erik appreciated his brother's confidence, but leadership had taught him to look beyond simple courage. Numbers mattered. Preparation mattered. Strategy mattered more than bravery, though both would be needed before this conflict ended. As the night deepened and his advisors departed to their homes, Erik found himself thinking about the day's acquisitions. Gold could be spent, weapons could be lost or broken, but people were different. Each slave represented a story, a life that had taken an unexpected turn. Most of them would work his lands until they died or earned their freedom through years of service. Some might even choose to stay, becoming full members of the community as others had before them. But the Chinese woman troubled his thoughts in ways he couldn't quite name. There had been something in her eyes during the auction, a flash of understanding that suggested she knew exactly what was happening to her and had already begun planning how to survive it. That kind of intelligence was dangerous in an enemy and valuable in an ally. Erik stepped outside his longhouse, breathing deeply of the cold air that carried the promise of snow. The settlement was quiet now. Families gathered around their fires, sharing the warmth and stories that would carry them through another winter. This was what he fought to protect, not just the buildings or the land, but the lives and relationships that made up the fabric of their community. Somewhere in the slave quarters, Mei Lin was probably still awake, still watching and learning. Erik wondered what she saw when she looked at their world, whether she recognized the bonds of loyalty and love that held them together, or if she saw only the violence and hardship that had brought her here. The first snowflakes began to fall. As Erik turned back toward his hall, each one catching the light from the windows like tiny stars, winter was indeed coming, and with it would come tests of everything he had built. He only hoped he would prove equal to the challenges ahead, whatever form they might take. The battle axe gleamed in the firelight as Erik passed beneath it one final time, its presence a constant reminder that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for. But increasingly, Erik found himself wondering if there might be things worth living for as well, things that required not just strength and courage, but wisdom and compassion. The fire crackled and settled as Erik prepared for sleep, but rest would not come easily. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions that would shape the future of everyone under his protection, including, he realized with surprise, the quiet Chinese woman who had somehow captured his attention without saying a single word. The scream cut through the morning air like a blade through silk, sharp and desperate enough to freeze every soul. Within hearing, Erik dropped the grain sack he had been inspecting and ran toward the sound, his boots pounding against the frost-covered ground. Behind him, he heard Bind and several warriors following, their weapons already drawn from habit, and training at the edge of the settlement, where the wooden walkway met the dark waters of the fjord. a crowd had gathered. Through the press of bodies, Erik could see young Olaf thrashing in the icy water, his small hands clawing at the slippery stones of the shore. The boy was only 7 winters old, the son of Erik's best shipwright, and the current was already pulling him toward the deeper channel where the water ran swift and merciless. He fell through the ice at the edge. Someone shouted. The planks gave way beneath him. Erik began stripping off his heavy cloak, knowing that someone had to go in, knowing that the shock of the cold water would likely claim whoever made the attempt. But before he could take another step, a small figure pushed past him and dove cleanly into the frigid fjord. Mei Lin moved through the water with a grace that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Where others would have been overcome by the cold, she swam with purposeful strokes toward the struggling child. Erik watched in amazement as she reached Olaf and spoke to him in a calm voice that somehow carried over the water. Her words foreign, but her tone soothing enough to still his panic. She kept the boy's head above water while navigating the current, using the flow rather than fighting it to guide them toward a section of shore where the stones provided better footing. When she finally pulled Olaf from the water, both of them blue-lipped and shaking, the crowd erupted in relieved cheers. But Mei Lin wasn't finished. She laid the boy on the walkway and began pressing on his chest in a rhythmic pattern that none of them had seen before. Water poured from Olaf's mouth, and suddenly he was coughing and breathing again, his color slowly returning as his mother wrapped him in her cloak. How did she know to do that? Astrid whispered, voicing the question that was on everyone's mind. Erik found himself studying Mei Lin as the crowd dispersed and the crisis passed. She sat quietly on the walkway, allowing the settlement women to wrap her in furs and force warm ale into her hands. But her eyes remained alert, taking in the faces around her, cataloging reactions, and storing information with the careful attention of someone accustomed to being the outsider. You saved my son. Gunhild, Olaf's mother, said through her tears. I don't care where you came from or what you were before. You are blessed by the gods. Mei Lin nodded respectfully, though Erik noticed she didn't speak. Whether from caution or inability, she kept her own counsel while accepting the gratitude being offered. As the day progressed, word of the rescue spread through the settlement like ripples on water. Erik found himself watching the reactions of his people, noting how their attitudes toward the foreign woman began to shift. Suspicion gave way to curiosity, and curiosity opened the door to something approaching respect. But it was later that evening when Erik truly began to understand what had happened that morning. A fever had struck several of the settlement's children, the kind of burning sickness that often claimed lives during the transition between seasons. The local healers were doing what they could with familiar remedies, but the fever seemed resistant to their usual treatments. Erik was making his evening rounds when he noticed a commotion near the slave quarters. Following the sound of worried voices, he discovered Mei Lin kneeling beside young Astrid's granddaughter, who had been burning with fever since midday. In her hands, Mei Lin held a collection of plants and herbs that Erik didn't recognize, grinding them between stones with practiced movements. What is she doing? Astrid demanded, though her tone held more curiosity than anger. Mei Lin looked up at Erik, and for the first time since her arrival, she spoke. Her accent was thick, her Norse limited, but her meaning was clear. Medicine. From my land. Help fever. She mixed the ground herbs with warm water, creating a paste that she applied to the child's wrists and forehead. Then, she began pressing specific points on the girl's arms and neck, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. This is witchcraft, one of the men muttered, but Erik raised a hand for silence. Let her work, he commanded, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Within an hour, the child's fever had broken. Within 2 hours, she was sitting up and asking for food. By morning, 3 other children had been treated the same way. and all were showing marked improvement. The settlement buzzed with wonder and speculation. Some called it magic, others claimed divine intervention, but Erik found himself drawn to a simpler explanation knowledge. Mei Lin possessed understanding that his people lacked, skills developed in a land where different problems required different solutions. "She's not what she appears to be," Astrid observed as they watched Mei Lin tend to another patient. "Slaves don't have that kind of learning. Common people don't move like that, don't think like that." Erik had been thinking the same thing. Everything about Mei Lin, from the way she carried herself to the confidence with which she approached problems, suggested a background far removed from the desperate circumstances in which he had found her. That evening, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. He approached Mei Lin as she cleaned her makeshift medical supplies, her movements still graceful despite the day's exhaustion. "You will eat at my table tonight," he told her. "The one who saved Olaf and healed our children deserves better than slave rations." Mei Lin looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything, and Erik felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude or even attraction. Here was someone who understood the weight of responsibility, who acted not from duty or fear, but from something more fundamental. "You honor me," she said simply, her voice carrying an accent that somehow made the familiar words sound like music. Hidden beneath the rough wool of her slave clothing, a small jade pendant caught the firelight, the only remnant of her former life that had survived the journey to this strange land. Erik noticed it briefly, a flash of green that spoke of craftsmanship and value, but he said nothing. Some secrets he was beginning to understand revealed themselves in their own time as they walked toward the longhouse together. Erik found himself wondering what other surprises this mysterious woman might hold and what it might mean for both of them that their paths had crossed in such an unlikely place. The morning after Mei Lin's first meal at the high table, Erik found himself making excuses to pass by wherever she was working. She had been assigned to help in the kitchens, as he had originally planned, but somehow her duties seemed to expand beyond the simple preparation of meals. The cook, Sigrid, had discovered that Mei Lin could identify which plants were safe to eat and which might poison a person, knowledge that proved invaluable as they prepared for the lean months ahead. "She knows things," Sigrid confided to Erik as he stopped by the kitchens, ostensibly to check on food stores. "Yesterday she showed me how to preserve meat using herbs I'd never thought to try. The taste is strange but good, and the preservation is better than anything I've seen." Erik nodded, filing away another piece of evidence that Mei Lin was far more than she appeared. He had been quietly observing her for days now, noting the small details that others might miss. The way she held herself spoke of confidence despite her circumstances. Her hands, though calloused from recent hard work, showed the fine bone structure of someone who had lived a gentler life. Most telling of all was the way she approached problems with the systematic thinking of someone accustomed to education and responsibility. That afternoon, Erik made a decision that caused raised eyebrows throughout the settlement. He had Sigrid prepare a basket of the best winter provisions, warm bread, dried fruits, smoked fish, and a skin of wine, and personally delivered it to Mei Lin's quarters. "You work hard," he explained when she looked at him with surprise. "Good. Work deserves recognition." But it was more than that, and they both knew it. Erik had begun to feel protective of this woman who'd arrived as a slave and was slowly revealing herself to be something much more complex. The thought of her shivering in the drafty slave quarters while Norwegian winter deepened troubled him in ways he couldn't quite explain. The children of the settlement had begun seeking Mei Lin out, drawn by her gentle manner and the fascinating stories she told in her improving Norse. She spoke of mountains that touched the sky, of cities larger than anything the Vikings could imagine, of traditions and customs that seemed magical to young minds accustomed to the practical realities of Nordic life. "Tell us about the dragons again," little Astrid would plead, and Mei Lin would smile and describe creatures of wisdom and power that bore little resemblance to the monsters of Viking legend. Erik often found himself pausing to listen from a distance, struck by the patience with which Mei Lin answered their endless questions. She had a gift for teaching, for taking complex ideas and making them accessible to curious minds. More than once, he noticed the children's mothers listening as well, their initial wariness giving way to genuine interest. But it was Bjorn who voiced what others were thinking, cornering Erik one evening as they inspected the settlement's defenses. "You're showing favoritism to that foreign woman," Bjorn said without preamble. "People are talking, Erik. They're saying you've lost your judgment, that she's bewitched you somehow." Erik continued his examination of a loose board in the palisade wall, though his hands tightened on the wood. "She saved Olaf's life. She's healed half the children in the settlement. If that's witchcraft, then we could use more of it." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Bjorn's voice carried the frustration of a younger brother who saw his elder making what he believed to be a mistake. "She's a slave, Erik, a foreign slave. When you treat her like an honored guest, it undermines everything we believe about order and hierarchy." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of young Leif, one of Erik's scouts, who approached with the quick stride of someone bearing urgent news. "Chieftain," Leif panted, having run the full distance from the northern boundaries. "Gunnar's men attacked the Eriksson farm. They took livestock and grain, but no lives were lost. Old Eriksson said they seemed more interested in sending a message than causing real damage." Erik exchanged a meaningful look with Bjorn. Gunnar was testing their responses, probing for weaknesses before committing to a larger assault. The attacks would escalate until Erik was forced to respond with violence, drawing them into the cycle of raid and counter-raid that had defined their father's generation. "Double the guard on the outer farms," Erik commanded, "and send word to our allies. I want to know who will stand with us when the real fighting begins." After Leif departed, Bjorn returned to his original concern. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Erik. War is coming, and our people need to see strength and unity from their leader. They need to see that you understand what we're fighting for, our traditions, our way of life. When you elevate a foreign slave above her station, it makes them question everything else." Erik found himself thinking about this conversation later that evening as he sat in his great hall, watching Mei Lin work quietly in the corner where Sigurd had set up a space for preparing medicinal remedies. Her movements were precise and economical, betraying a familiarity with the work that spoke of formal training rather than desperate improvisation. Hidden among her few possessions, Erik had glimpsed what appeared to be written materials, not the crude scratch marks that passed for writing among most of his people, but elegant characters that suggested literacy in a sophisticated writing system. The implications of this were staggering. Education of that level was reserved for the highest ranks of society in any culture he knew. "You're watching her again," Astrid observed, settling beside Erik with her own cup of ale. The old woman had a way of appearing when her counsel was most needed, though she never forced her advice on those who weren't ready to hear it. "She interests me," Erik admitted. "There are depths to her that we haven't begun to understand." "I've been thinking the same thing," Astrid replied. "The way she moves, the knowledge she possesses, the composure she maintains despite everything. That's happened to her. That's not the bearing of a common-born person, Erik. That's nobility." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. If Mei Lin truly was noble-born, then her presence here represented something far more complex than a simple case of slavery. It might mean she was valuable in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor as a hostage, as a connection to distant powers, or as someone with knowledge that could prove crucial in the conflicts ahead. Whatever she was before, she's here now, Erik said finally. And she's proven her worth to this community. That should be enough. But even as he spoke the words, Erik knew that the questions surrounding Mei Lin would not be easily dismissed. Her past would catch up with him eventually, and when it did, he would need to be ready for the consequences of the choices he was making now. That night, as snow fell softly outside the longhouse and the fire settled into glowing embers, Erik made another decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He instructed Sigrid to move Mei Lin from the slave quarters to a small room adjacent to the main hall, ostensibly so she could be more available for medical emergencies, but really because the thought of her suffering in the cold had become unbearable to him. The decision would cause more talk, more questions about his judgment and priorities. But as Erik lay down to sleep, he found that he didn't care what others thought. Some instinct deeper than social convention told him that protecting Mei Lin was not just the right thing to do. It was essential to everything he hoped to build. In the difficult times ahead, the Feast of the Winter Solstice had always been Erik's favorite celebration, a time when the settlement came together to share food, stories, and hope for the return of longer days. But this year's gathering carried an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with the approaching war and everything to do with the woman sitting at the high table beside him. Erik's decision to seat Mei Lin among the honored guests had caused a stir that rippled through the hall like stones dropped in still water. Conversation stopped mid-sentence when she entered, and Erik could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching, judging, trying to understand what had possessed their chieftain to elevate a slave to such prominence. "Are you certain about this?" Astrid had asked when Erik announced his intentions earlier that day. "The people respect your judgment, but this will test that respect in ways you might not anticipate." Erik had considered her warning carefully, but something inside him refused to ask Mei Lin to remain hidden away while the rest of the community celebrated. She had earned her place among them through service and sacrifice, and he would not diminish that achievement to spare the sensibilities of those who couldn't see past the circumstances of her arrival. Mei Lin herself seemed aware of the controversy her presence caused, though she gave no sign of discomfort. She wore the simple but clean dress that Erik had provided, and around her neck hung a silver bracelet that had belonged to his mother, a family heirloom. He had given her that morning in a gesture that surprised even himself. The bracelet caught the firelight as she moved, and Erik noticed several people staring at it with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disapproval. His mother's jewelry was not something he shared lightly, and its presence on Mei Lin's wrist sent a message that he wasn't entirely sure he was ready to defend. "Tell me about your homeland," Erik found himself saying as the meal progressed, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to break the uncomfortable silence that had settled over their section of the table. Mei Lin paused in her eating, considering her words carefully. Her Norse had improved dramatically over the past weeks, though she still spoke with deliberate precision that suggested translation happening in her mind. "My father was," she began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider. "My father worked for important men. We lived in a great city, larger than many kingdoms here. Stone buildings that reached toward the sky, markets that sold goods from every corner of the world." "A merchant, then?" Erik prompted, though something in her hesitation suggested there was more to the story. "Something like that," Mei Lin agreed, but her eyes held depths that spoke of carefully guarded secrets. The conversation was interrupted by Gunhild raising her cup in a toast. "To the woman who saved my son," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "May the gods smile upon her as she has smiled upon us." A cheer went up from several tables, though Erik noticed that others remained pointedly silent. The division in his community was becoming more apparent with each passing day, and he knew that his handling of the Mei Lin situation was only part of a larger question about his leadership style and vision for their future. After the formal meal ended and the serious drinking began, Erik found himself drawn into conversations about the approaching conflict with Gunnar. His warriors reported increasing signs of preparation in the enemy camp's weapons being forged, alliances being negotiated, supplies being stockpiled for a major offensive. "He's planning something for spring," Bjorn observed, his words slightly slurred by ale, but his strategic thinking still sharp. "The question is whether he'll wait for the ground to thaw or try to catch us off guard with a winter assault." "Winter would be foolish," one of the older warriors argued. "Too many variables, too much risk of weather turning against the attacker." But Erik found his attention drifting to where Mei Lin sat quietly, listening to the military discussion, with an intensity that seemed unusual for someone whose background was supposedly mercantile. She asked few questions, but the ones she did ask revealed an understanding of tactics and logistics that impressed the experienced fighters around. "The table. In my land," she said during a lull in the conversation, "generals say that winter war is won by preparation more than courage. The side that plans better for cold and hunger wins before the first sword is drawn." The table fell silent, and Erik could see his warriors processing this observation with the respect they might give to advice from a seasoned commander. It was another piece of evidence that Mei Lin's background included more than simple merchant training. "You've seen war before," Bjorn stated, studying her with new interest. Mei Lin nodded slowly. "Trade routes require protection. Merchants who travel far must understand how conflicts develop, how to avoid them when possible, and survive them when necessary." It was a reasonable explanation, but Erik caught the subtle way she phrased her response, not claiming personal experience with combat, but not denying knowledge that could only come from intimate familiarity with military matters. As the evening progressed and the ale flowed more freely, the conversations became more heated. Erik overheard snippets of discussion from other tables, fragments of opinion about his leadership, about the coming war, about the propriety of honoring a foreign slave at their most sacred celebration. "She's changed him," someone muttered. Not quite quietly enough. "Our chieftain thinks more about protecting one woman than defending his people." The words stung because they contained a grain of truth that Erik couldn't completely deny. His feelings for Mei Lin had grown beyond simple attraction or even respect. Somewhere in the past weeks, concern had deepened into something that felt dangerously close to love, and that development was affecting his judgment in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. When the formal celebration ended and people began drifting toward their homes, Erik found himself walking with Mei Lin through the quiet settlement. The snow crunched beneath their feet, and their breath formed clouds in the cold air. But the silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. "Your people are worried," Mei Lin observed as they approached the longhouse. "Some of them," Erik agreed. "Change is never easy, especially when it comes quickly." "I bring change," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "My presence here disrupts the order they understand. That makes me dangerous to them, even if I mean no harm." Erik stopped walking and turned to face her, struck by the clarity with which she saw their situation. "Do you regret being here?" Mei Lin considered the question seriously, as she seemed to consider everything. "I regret the circumstances that brought me here," she said finally. "But I do not regret the place where I have landed." The words hung in the cold air between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. But when their eyes met in the moonlight, Erik felt the foundation of his world shift in ways that had nothing to do with war or politics and everything to do with the recognition of something precious and unexpected. The silver bracelet caught the light as Mei Lin reached up to pull her cloak more tightly around her shoulders, and Erik realized that giving her his mother's jewelry had been more than an impulse. It had been a declaration of intent that he was only now beginning to understand. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever conflicts arose from his unconventional choices, Erik knew that he could no longer imagine facing them without this remarkable woman at his side. The realization should have frightened him more than it did. The sound of the war horn echoed across the settlement like the voice of doom. Itself, its deep, resonant call cutting through the morning mist and sending every soul within hearing into immediate action. Erik was inspecting the grain stores when the alarm sounded, but he dropped everything and ran toward the watchtower, his heart pounding with the certainty that the moment he had been dreading had finally arrived. From the elevated platform, he could see them clearly, Gunnar Bloodaxe and his war party, approaching under a banner of temporary truce, their weapons sheathed, but their intentions unmistakable. The rival chieftain rode at the head of nearly 30 warriors, all of them armed, and armored for serious conflict. This was not a social visit. "He's come to make his formal challenge," Bjorn observed, joining Erik on the platform with his own weapons already strapped in place. "The traditional way, so no one can say he didn't give us fair warning," Erik nodded grimly. Viking law required that major conflicts be preceded by formal declarations, opportunities for the opposing parties to state their grievances and attempt resolution through negotiation. Of course, everyone understood that these rituals were mere formalities when warriors like Gunnar had already decided that violence was their preferred solution. "To gather the war council," Erik commanded. "Full assembly in the great hall. I want our response to be measured and unified." But as the morning progressed and Gunnar's delegation settled into the guest quarters, traditionally provided even to enemies under flags of truce, Erik found himself thinking about more than military strategy. The formal challenge would come with specific terms and conditions, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of his settlement but the future of everyone under his protection, including Mei Lin. The thought of her potentially falling into Gunnar's hands filled Erik with a cold fury that surprised him with its intensity. When had her safety become so central to his thinking? When had protecting one person become as important as protecting his entire community? The war council convened in the great hall with all the ceremony that tradition demanded. Erik's most trusted advisors took their places around the great table. Bjorn, Astrid, the ship captains, the master craftsmen, and the leaders of the various family groups that made up their settlement. Notably absent from the traditional assembly was any representation from the slaves or lower-ranking workers, a hierarchy that Erik had never questioned before, but now found himself examining with new eyes. Gunnar entered with the swagger of a man who believed himself to hold all the advantages. He was younger than Erik by perhaps 5 years, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from a series of easy victories against weaker opponents. His reputation as a warrior was well earned, but Erik had always suspected that Gunnar's strategic thinking lagged behind his skill with weapons. "Erik Ironwood," Gunnar began without preamble, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "I come before your people to state my grievances and demand satisfaction." The formal language was required by tradition, but the underlying message was simple enough. Gunnar wanted Erik's territory, his trade routes, his influence among the neighboring settlements. The specific complaints, alleged insults, disputed boundaries, claims of treaty violations were merely the justification for a war he had already decided to fight. "Speak your grievances," Erik replied, matching the ritual tone while studying his opponent's face for any hint of what he was really planning. As Gunnar launched into his prepared speech, Erik noticed movement in the shadows near the hall's entrance. Mei Lin had positioned herself where she could observe the proceedings without drawing attention. Her presence so quiet and unobtrusive that most of the assembly probably didn't realize she was there, but Erik could see her listening intently, her eyes moving between the speakers with the focused attention of someone analyzing every word for tactical significance. When Gunnar mentioned his recent recruitment of Danish mercenaries, Erik caught a subtle change in Mei Lin's expression, a tightening around her eyes that suggested she understood. the military implications better than many of his own advisors. Furthermore, Gunnar continued, his voice growing more heated as he built toward his climax, I challenge the legitimacy of your leadership. A chieftain who elevates slaves above free men, who listens to foreign counsel above the wisdom of his own people, has lost the mandate of the gods and forfeited his right to rule. The hall erupted in angry shouts from Erik's supporters, but Erik himself remained calm, though he felt a cold anger building in his chest. The personal attack was clearly designed to provoke an emotional response, to make him appear weak or out of control in front of his own people. I answer to my people and the gods, not to ambitious neighbors who covet what they have not earned, Erik replied evenly. If you wish to challenge my leadership, you know the traditional forms. But first, you will show proper respect for the customs of hospitality and the laws that bind all civilized men. It was a masterful response that managed to reject Gunnar's authority while invoking the very traditions that Gunnar claimed to defend. Erik could see his own supporters nodding approvingly, and even some of Gunnar's warriors seemed impressed by the measured dignity of the reply. But Gunnar had not come this far to be deterred by clever words. Very well, he snarled. Let the forms be observed. I challenge you to single combat, Erik Ironwood, with the leadership of both our settlements as the prize. Winner takes all lands, people, property, everything. The challenge hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Single combat was the most decisive form of Viking dispute resolution, but it was also the most dangerous. One fight would determine the fate of hundreds of people, and there would be no opportunity for negotiation or compromise once the weapons were drawn. I accept your challenge, Erik said without hesitation, though he could hear Astrid's sharp intake of breath from across the table. Name your terms. 3 days hence, at sunrise, on the traditional ground at Sword Point. Weapons of choice. Fight to the death. The gods will decide whose cause is just. Erik nodded formally, sealing the agreement that would determine his fate and the future of everyone he protected. But even as he spoke the ritual words of acceptance, his mind was already working on the larger implications of what was about to unfold. After Gunnar and his warriors departed to make their preparations, the War Council remained in session to discuss strategy and contingencies. But Erik found his attention repeatedly drawn to the corner where Mei Lin continued to observe. Her presence a reminder that this conflict involved more than just territorial disputes between rival chieftains. She understands what's happening, Astrid observed, following Erik's gaze, and she knows what it means for her if you lose. Erik did not need the reminder. If he fell in single combat, Mei Lin would once again become property to be distributed among the victors. All the progress she had made, all the respect she had earned, would vanish in an instant. She would be back where she started, only this time in the hands of a man who would view her as both a trophy and a symbol of his victory over Erik's unconventional leadership. I won't lose, Erik said firmly, though he knew that no warrior, however skilled, could guarantee victory in single combat. But as the council continued its deliberations, Erik found himself thinking about more than just the mechanics of the upcoming fight. This challenge represented something larger than a personal dispute. It was a test of everything he had tried to build, everything he believed about leadership and community, and the possibility of change. The war horn that had announced Gunnar's arrival still hung in its place of honor, its bronze surface gleaming in the firelight. Tomorrow it would sound again, calling the settlement to witness a battle that would reshape their world one way or another. Erik only hoped he would prove worthy of the trust his people had placed in him, and of the unexpected love that had complicated his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. In the depths of night, when the settlement lay quiet under a blanket of fresh snow, Erik discovered that sleep would not come. His mind churned with strategies and contingencies, analyzing every aspect of the upcoming combat while his body remained tense with the anticipation of violence. He had risen from his bed and was pacing the great hall when he noticed the soft glow of candlelight coming from the alcove where Mei Lin worked on her healing preparations. She looked up as he approached, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering flame as she continued grinding herbs with practiced efficiency. Spread before her on the rough wooden table were materials Erik didn't recognize: strips of bark, covered with intricate markings that looked like no writing system he had ever seen. "You cannot sleep either," she observed. A voice soft in the darkness. Erik settled onto the bench across from her, fascinated despite his preoccupation with the morning's challenges. "What are you writing?" Mei Lin's hands paused in their work, and for a moment Erik thought she might not answer. Then she gestured to the bark strips with something that might have been pride or perhaps melancholy. "Records," she said simply. "Stories of this place, these people, your customs and beliefs, the way you organize your society, the relationships between families and clans." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "In my homeland, such knowledge is considered valuable. Understanding different peoples, their strengths and weaknesses, their ways of thinking and fighting." The implications of her words sent a chill through Erik that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You're gathering intelligence." "I'm learning," Mei Lin corrected gently, but there was steel beneath the silk of her voice. "I was taught that survival depends on understanding, and understanding requires careful observation." Erik found himself studying her with new eyes, seeing past the gentle healer and gifted teacher to glimpse something harder and more calculating beneath. "Who taught you such things?" Mei Lin set down her grinding stone and met his gaze directly. For the first time since her arrival, Erik saw her defenses lower slightly, revealing depths of pain and loss that she had kept carefully hidden. "My father was General Liu Wei, military advisor to the imperial court," she said quietly. "I am Liu Mei Lin, and I was raised in the Forbidden City to serve the emperor as a diplomatic envoy to foreign kingdoms." The words hit Erik like a physical blow. Noble birth he had suspected, but this revelation transformed everything he thought he understood about her presence in his settlement. A Chinese imperial envoy didn't end up in a Viking slave market by accident or misfortune. She had been deliberately targeted, captured, and sold to hide her true identity. "You were on a diplomatic mission when you were taken," Erik said, pieces falling into place in his mind. Mei Lin nodded, her composure intact despite the obvious pain of the memory. "A peace delegation to the northern kingdoms, carrying proposals for trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. We were 3 days from our destination when pirates attacked our ship. Most of my escort died fighting, but I was kept alive, valuable cargo to be sold in distant markets where no one would recognize my importance." Erik felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over him: admiration for her courage in the face of such losses, anger at those who had reduced her to property, and a growing understanding of why she had observed his people with such systematic attention. She had been trained from childhood to analyze political and military situations, to identify the strengths and vulnerabilities that could be exploited in negotiation or conflict. "The intelligence you've gathered," he said slowly. "What have you learned about us?" Mei Lin smiled sadly, and Erik realized that his question had multiple layers of meaning. She was seeing him not just as a man she had come to care for, but as a chieftain whose methods and character she had been professionally evaluating. "Your people are strong individually, but divided by old grudges and traditional thinking," she said with the directness he had come to expect from her. "Gunnar understands this. His strategy is not just to defeat you in combat, but to exploit the fractures in your community afterward." "What fractures?" Erik asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "The division between those who support your more inclusive leadership and those who believe you have abandoned traditional values." The tension between older and younger warriors about tactics and honor. The uncertainty about succession if something happens to you, given that Born is respected but not universally trusted. Each observation was accurate and insightful, the product of weeks of careful study by someone trained to identify political vulnerabilities. But Erik found himself focusing on the underlying implications of what she was telling him. You could have used this information to escape, he realized. You could have made contact with Gunnar or one of the other chieftains, offered intelligence in exchange for protection and passage home. Mei Lin's hands returned to their careful work with the herbs, but Erik could see the tension in her shoulders. I considered it, she admitted quietly. In the early days, when I believed you were just another barbarian warlord who had purchased convenient property. What changed your mind? The question hung between them in the candlelit darkness, heavy with personal and political implications. When Mei Lin finally answered, her voice carried an emotion that she had kept carefully controlled. Until now. You did, she said simply. You and your people. I expected cruelty and found kindness. I expected ignorance and found wisdom. I expected to be used and discarded, and instead found, she paused, searching for words in a language that was still foreign to her tongue, found acceptance, respect, perhaps even love. The last word was spoken so softly that Erik almost missed it, but its impact was immediate and overwhelming. Whatever political calculations had brought them to this moment, whatever strategic considerations should govern his thinking, Erik found himself reaching across the table to take her hands in his. Mei Lin, he began, then stopped, realizing that he was about to cross a line from which there might be no return. She seemed to understand his hesitation, the weight of leadership and responsibility that made every personal decision carry broader consequences. Tomorrow you fight for your people's future, she said gently. Tonight you are simply a man who has found something precious in an unexpected place. When their lips met across the candlelit table, Erik felt the last of his defenses crumble. Whatever the morning might bring, whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew with absolute certainty that his life had been irrevocably changed by this remarkable woman, who had arrived as a slave and revealed herself to be so much more. Later, as they sat together in comfortable silence, Mei Lin's head resting against his shoulder, Erik found himself thinking about the hidden letters she had written, the careful documentation of his people's strengths and weaknesses in the hands of an enemy. Such intelligence could prove devastating. But in the hands of someone who truly cared about their welfare, it might become the foundation for something entirely new, a way of governing that combined the best of different traditions and approaches. After tomorrow, he said quietly, regardless of what happens, I want you to know that you have changed everything for me. Not just my feelings, but my understanding of what leadership means, of what our community could become. Mei Lin lifted her head to look at him, and in her dark eyes, Erik saw a reflection of his own hopes and fears. What we have built together will not end with a single battle, she said with quiet conviction. Ideas once planted have a way of growing even in hostile soil. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Erik realized that she was right. Whatever the outcome of his combat with Gunnar, the changes that Mei Lin had inspired in his thinking and in his community would continue to unfold. The question was whether he would be alive to guide that transformation, or whether others would shape the future according to their own vision of what was right and necessary. The war horn remained silent in the growing light, but Erik knew that soon it would sound again, calling the settlement to witness a battle that would determine far more than simple territorial control. It would decide whether love and wisdom could triumph over tradition and force, whether the future belonged to those who embraced change or those who sought to preserve the past at any cost. The morning of the combat dawned gray and cold, with low clouds promising snow before the day's end. Erik had risen before sunrise to prepare himself mentally and physically for the trial ahead. But his final preparations were interrupted by Bjorn's urgent arrival in the great hall. "Erik, you need to see this," his brother said without preamble, holding what appeared to be a small jade object wrapped in silk cloth. "I found it among her belongings when I went to check on her this morning. She wasn't in her quarters. No one has seen her since before dawn." Erik's blood ran cold as he unwrapped the object, revealing an intricately carved seal made of white jade and bearing symbols that spoke of imperial authority and ancient power. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of artistry that could only be produced by the most skilled craftsmen working for the highest levels of government. "Do you know what this is?" Bjorn continued, his voice tight with concern and suspicion. "It's an imperial seal, Erik, the kind carried by envoys speaking with the full authority of the Chinese emperor. She's not just nobility, she's practically royalty." Erik stared at the seal, his mind racing through the implications of what his brother had discovered. Everything about Mei Lin's story suddenly took on new dimensions of complexity and danger. If she truly carried imperial credentials, then her capture and sale into slavery represented not just a personal tragedy, but a potential international incident of enormous proportions. "Where did you say you found this?" Erik asked, though his thoughts were already turning to more pressing concerns. Where was Mei Lin? Why had she disappeared on the morning when he most needed to focus on the upcoming combat? "Hidden in a leather pouch sewn into the lining of her dress," Bjorn replied. "Erik, if Gunnar learns about this, if he realizes what she really is, he'll use it against you. He'll claim you've been harboring state secrets, that you're planning alliances with foreign powers against your own people." The sound of horns from the watchtower interrupted their conversation, announcing that Gunnar's forces were approaching Sword Point for the scheduled combat. Erik felt his world tilting as multiple crises converged at the worst possible moment. "Find her," he commanded Bjorn. "Search the settlement, the surrounding forest, everywhere. I need to know where she is and why she left." But even as he spoke, Erik had a sinking feeling that Mei Lin's disappearance was not voluntary. The timing was too convenient, too perfectly designed to distract and demoralize him before his most important battle, the walk to Sword Point. Took 20 minutes through the frost-covered pine forest, following a path that generations of warriors had used for settling disputes through single combat. Erik's supporters accompanied him in a somber procession, their faces reflecting the gravity of what was about to unfold. But Erik's mind was divided between the immediate challenge of facing Gunnar and the larger mystery of what had happened to the woman he loved. Gunnar was already at the combat ground when they arrived, his weapons gleaming in the pale morning light, as he performed practice strikes with the casual confidence of a man who had never lost a fight. His supporters had formed a loose circle around the designated area, and Erik could see several faces he didn't recognize, mercenaries and allies who had come to witness what they clearly expected to be their leader's triumph. "Erik Ironwood," Gunnar called out as Erik entered the circle, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I trust you slept well, considering it was your last night as a free man." Erik ignored the taunt, focusing instead on his assessment of the combat area and his opponent's apparent readiness. But his concentration was shattered when he saw a familiar figure standing among Gunnar's supporters. Mei Lin stood between two of Gunnar's warriors, her hands bound behind her back and her dress torn from what had obviously been a struggle. Her face bore the marks of rough treatment, but her eyes blazed with defiant fury that suggested her spirit remained unbroken. "I believe you've been looking for this," Gunnar said with a cold smile, gesturing toward his captive. "Imagine my surprise when my scouts found her trying to escape through the forest in the pre-dawn darkness. Almost as surprising as discovering the interesting items she was carrying." Gunnar held up the imperial seal, its jade surface catching the morning light as he displayed it for everyone to see. "Tell me, Erik Ironwood, how long have you been harboring a Chinese spy? How many of your settlement's secrets has she passed?" belong to her imperial masters? The accusation hit Erik like a physical blow, not because he believed it, but because he could see how effectively it was working on the assembled crowd. His own supporters looked confused and concerned, while Gunnar's. All eyes nodded with satisfaction at this confirmation of their leader's superior judgment. "She is no spy," Erik declared, his voice carrying clearly across the combat ground. "She is a diplomatic envoy who was captured and enslaved through piracy. I have given her the protection that any civilized leader would offer to someone in such circumstances. Protection?" Gunnar laughed mockingly. "Is that what you call it when you seat a foreign agent at your high table? When you give her access to your military councils and strategic planning sessions? When you share your bed with someone whose loyalty belongs to distant emperors?" Erik felt his temper rising at the crude implications, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was exactly what Gunnar wanted to provoke him into fighting angry and unfocused. "The woman's identity changes nothing about our dispute," Erik said firmly. "You challenged me to single combat to determine leadership of our territories. I accepted that challenge. Let us settle this matter honorably, as our fathers would have done." But Gunnar was not finished exploiting the political advantage that Mei Lin's capture had given him. "Oh, but it changes everything," he replied with cool satisfaction. "You see, I have a proposal that might interest you. Fight me as planned, and when I defeat you, your precious Chinese princess becomes my property along with everything else you hold dear. But if you prefer to spare her the indignities I have planned, you could simply yield now and accept exile. Walk away from everything you've built, and I'll allow her to return safely to her homeland." The proposal sent a shock through the assembled crowd, and Erik could see his supporters exchanging worried glances. Gunnar had skillfully transformed the simple combat challenge into a test of Erik's personal priorities, forcing him to choose between his duty to his people and his love for Mei Lin. "Choose quickly," Gunnar continued, savoring his psychological advantage. "My men are eager to begin their victory celebration, and I would hate for them to grow impatient with your deliberations." Erik looked across the circle at Mei Lin, seeing in her eyes a message that needed no translation. She was telling him to fight, to ignore the threat to her safety, and focus on protecting his people. But she was also telling him something else, something that only he would understand given what she had revealed about her true identity and training. "I choose to fight," Erik declared, drawing his sword with a ring of steel that echoed across the combat ground. "But know this, Gunnar Bloodaxe, you have made a mistake that will cost you everything. You think you understand what motivates me, but you understand nothing about honor, nothing about love, and nothing about the kind of leader your people truly need." As the two warriors moved to the center of the circle and began the ritual exchanges that preceded formal combat, Erik caught one last glimpse of Mei Lin's face. What he saw there was not fear or despair, but the cold calculation of someone who had been trained from childhood to turn apparent defeat into unexpected victory. The imperial seal might have revealed her true identity, but it had also revealed something about Gunnar's character that could prove decisive in the larger conflict ahead. The man who would use a defenseless woman as a weapon was the same man who would ultimately betray anyone who trusted him with power. The battle was about to begin, but Erik now understood that the real war would be won or lost by the choices his people made about the kind of future they wanted to build together. The ceremonial sword felt heavier than usual in Erik's hands as he performed the ritual preparations for single combat, its ancient blade reflecting the gray morning light, with the weight of generations of Ironwood chieftains who had wielded it before him. This was the same weapon his father had carried into his final battle, the same steel that had sealed oaths and settled disputes for 3 generations of his family. But as Erik moved through the traditional forms, testing his grip, checking his balance, feeling the familiar weight distribution that could mean the difference between life and death. His mind was not entirely focused on the upcoming fight. Part of his attention remained fixed on Mei Lin, studying her captors for signs of weakness, analyzing the positioning of Gunnar's supporters for opportunities that might present themselves. "You're thinking like a strategist instead of a warrior," Astrid observed quietly, having approached close enough to speak without being overheard by Gunnar's people. "That's good. Your father always said that the battles won before the fighting begins are the ones that matter most." Erik nodded, though. His jaw remained tight with the tension of knowing that this combat represented far more than a simple test of martial skill. Gunnar had deliberately raised the stakes by involving Mei Lin, transforming what should have been a straightforward leadership challenge into a complex political and personal crisis. "If something happens to me," Erik said quietly, "make sure Bjorn understands what she really is." Her value as a diplomatic asset could change everything about how we relate to the outside world. "Nothing's going to happen to you," Astrid replied firmly, though Erik could hear the uncertainty beneath her confident words. "You've been preparing for this kind of fight your entire life. Trust your training, trust your experience, and remember that you're fighting for more than just your own survival." The crowd around the combat circle had grown as word spread through both settlements about the dramatic revelations surrounding Mei Lin's identity. Erik could see his own people struggling to process the implications of what they had learned. That their chieftain had unknowingly harbored a Chinese imperial envoy. That the woman they had come to respect and admire was connected to powers beyond their understanding. Some faces showed concern about the political ramifications. Others reflected admiration for Erik's instinctive protection of someone who had needed help regardless of her true status. But all of them understood that the outcome of this fight would determine not just their leadership, but their entire approach to dealing with the larger world beyond their fjords. Gunnar completed his own preparations with theatrical flourishes, designed to intimidate and impress. He was younger than Erik, perhaps stronger in raw physical terms, and he fought with the aggressive confidence of someone who had built his reputation on a series of victories against overmatched opponents. But Erik had been studying his rival's technique, and he could see patterns and preferences that might be exploited by a more experienced fighter. "The terms remain as stated," Gunnar announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Single combat, to the death, with leadership of both settlements as the prize. The gods will judge whose cause is just, and the victor will take everything lands, people, property, and," his eyes moved deliberately to Mei Lin, "special treasures." Erik felt his anger surge at the implication, but he channeled that emotion into focus rather than allowing it to cloud his judgment. Anger could be useful in combat if properly controlled, providing strength and determination without compromising tactical thinking. "I understand the terms," Erik replied evenly. "But understand this, whatever the outcome of our fight, you have revealed your true character to everyone watching. A leader who would use a helpless woman as a weapon against his opponent is not a leader who can be trusted with power over others." The words carried clearly across the combat ground, and Erik could see them having an effect on some of Gunnar's own supporters. Doubt was a powerful weapon when wielded skillfully, and Erik had learned that battles could be won as much through psychology as through swordplay. But Gunnar was not easily deterred from his chosen course. "Save your speeches for the grave," he snarled, raising his weapon to signal his readiness to begin. "Today we settle this matter with steel, as our ancestors intended." The formal combat began with the traditional exchange of strikes, each warrior testing the other's defenses and reaction time while the crowd watched in tense silence. Erik had fought in single combat before, but never with stakes this high, never with so many lives hanging in the balance. Gunnar fought aggressively from the start, pressing forward with a series of powerful attacks designed to overwhelm Erik's defenses through sheer force. His technique was solid but predictable, The approach of someone who had won previous fights through superior strength and athleticism rather than tactical sophistication. Erik gave ground initially, allowing Gunnar to expend energy while he studied his opponent's patterns and timing. The ceremonial sword felt perfectly balanced in his hands, its familiar weight providing reassurance, even as the stakes of the combat became increasingly clear. But even as he focused on the immediate tactical challenges of the fight, Erik remained aware of the larger drama unfolding around them. He could see Mei Lin watching intently from her position among Gunnar's supporters, her eyes tracking every move and counter-move with the analytical attention of someone who understood military strategy. More importantly, he could see his own people beginning to understand what this fight really represented. This was not just about territorial control or personal rivalry. It was about two fundamentally different approaches to leadership and community. Gunnar represented the old ways, the belief that might made right and that strength was the only currency that mattered in a harsh world. Erik represented something different, though he was only beginning to understand what that might be. His protection of Mei Lin, his willingness to challenge traditional hierarchies, his openness to learning from unexpected sources, all of these suggested a different kind of leadership, one based on wisdom and adaptation rather than simple dominance. The crowd gasped as Gunnar's blade came within inches of Erik's throat, a powerful thrust that would have ended the fight if not for Erik's quick reflexes and defensive training. But the near miss also revealed something important about Gunnar's fighting style. He committed too fully to his attacks, leaving himself momentarily vulnerable to counterstrikes. "Getting tired already, old man?" Gunnar taunted, though Erik could see sweat beading on his opponent's forehead despite the cold morning air. Erik didn't respond to the provocation, saving his breath for the combat while his mind worked through the tactical possibilities that were beginning to present themselves. Gunnar was strong and aggressive, but he was also predictable. And predictability was a weakness that could be exploited by a more patient and experienced fighter. As the combat continued, Erik began to see the pattern he had been looking for, the slight telegraphing Gunnar's shoulder movement before his most powerful attacks, the tendency to drop his guard fractionally when he was preparing to press forward. These were small things, barely noticeable to casual observers, but they were the kind of details that could determine the outcome of a closely matched fight. The ceremonial sword sang through the air as Erik began his counterattack, no longer simply defending, but actively working to create the opening he would need to end this conflict once and for all. Around the combat circle, the crowd held its collective breath, sensing that the decisive moment was approaching. But Erik's thoughts were not entirely focused on victory in combat. He was also thinking about what would happen afterward, about the choices his people would face regardless of who emerged victorious from this ancient ritual of violence and determination. The real battle, he was beginning to understand, would be fought not with swords but with ideas, not through force but through the power of example and vision. The morning sun broke through the clouds as the two warriors circled each other with the wary respect of professionals who understood that one mistake could prove fatal. But in that moment of clarity and light, Erik finally understood what he was truly fighting for. Not just his own survival, or even the protection of his settlement, but the possibility of a future where strength and wisdom could work together to build something better than what had come before. The decisive moment came when Gunnar made the mistake Erik had been waiting for, a wild overhead strike that committed his entire body to the attack, but left his left side momentarily exposed. Erik stepped inside the arc of the descending blade and drove his shoulder into Gunnar's ribs, using his opponent's momentum against him to send the younger man stumbling backward toward the edge of the combat circle. But Gunnar recovered more quickly than Erik had anticipated, spinning away from the attempted grapple and bringing his sword around in a vicious horizontal slice that would have opened Erik's throat, if not for a desperate backward leap that carried him beyond the reach of the steel. the crowd erupted in shouts of encouragement and dismay as both warriors paused to reassess their positions, their breath forming clouds in the cold air as they circled each other with renewed wariness. Blood ran from a shallow cut on Erik's arm where Gunnar's blade had found its mark, while his opponent favored his left side where Erik's shoulder strike had landed with significant force. "First blood to me," Gunnar panted, though his confidence seemed forced rather than genuine. Erik said nothing, conserving his energy while his mind worked through what he had learned from the exchange. Gunnar was indeed strong and fast, but he was also becoming predictable in his patterns, relying too heavily on power and aggression without the tactical flexibility that came from extensive combat experience. The fight resumed with renewed intensity, both warriors understanding that the outcome would likely be decided within the next few exchanges. Gunnar pressed his attack with desperate determination, his blade work becoming more wild and less controlled as fatigue began to affect his judgment. But it was at this moment, when the combat appeared to be reaching its climax, that everything changed with shocking suddenness. Mei Lin moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible given her bound hands, somehow slipping the restraints that had held her while her guard's attention was focused on the dramatic sword fight. What she pulled from her hair appeared to be nothing more than a simple ornament, but Erik could see the glint of sharpened metal as she transformed the decorative hairpin into an improvised weapon. The god closest to her never saw the attack coming. Mei Lin's improvised blade found the gap between his neck and shoulder with surgical precision, and he dropped to the ground without a sound. The second guard had time to shout a warning before she struck him as well, her movements displaying a level of combat training that stunned everyone who witnessed it. "She's escaping!" someone yelled, but Mei Lin was already in motion, darting between the surprised spectators with the speed and agility of someone who had clearly planned this moment carefully. The distraction was exactly what Erik needed. Gunnar's attention wavered for just an instant as he tried to process what was happening behind him. And in that moment of divided focus, Erik struck with all the skill and experience he had accumulated. Over 15 years of warfare, his blade found its mark just below Gunnar's ribcage, sliding between the bones to pierce his opponent's heart with the clean efficiency of a master swordsman. Gunnar's eyes widened in surprise and pain before the light faded from them, and he collapsed to the frost-covered ground as his life ebbed away. But Erik had no time to savor his victory or to acknowledge the cheers of his supporters. Gunnar's warriors were already moving to recapture Mei Lin, and several of them had drawn their weapons with the clear intention of avenging their fallen leader regardless of the traditional rules governing single combat. The challenge is ended, Erik shouted, raising his bloody sword for all to see. "I have defeated Gunnar Bloodaxe in fair combat, as witnessed by all present. Any who wish to dispute this outcome can face me in the same manner." Most of Gunnar's supporters hesitated at this declaration, uncertain about their legal standing now that their leader was dead. But the mercenaries and foreign fighters among them had no investment in Viking traditions of honor and fair play. Erik found himself fighting for his life against multiple opponents as the organized single combat dissolved into a chaotic melee. His ceremonial sword was perfect for individual dueling, but less ideal for the kind of desperate, close-quarters fighting that now erupted around the combat circle. It was Mei Lin who turned the tide of this secondary battle. Instead of fleeing to safety as Erik had expected, she had been systematically freeing the other captives that Gunnar's forces had brought with them, slaves and prisoners, who had been watching the combat from the sidelines. "To Mei," she called in Norse, her voice carrying clearly over the sounds of battle. "Fight for your freedom." The newly freed captives responded with desperate courage, understanding that this might be their only chance to escape bondage. They fell upon Gunnar's remaining forces with improvised weapons and the fury of people who had nothing left to lose. Erik fought his way through the chaos toward Mei Lin, determined to protect her, even as she demonstrated her own remarkable ability to protect herself. Her improvised weapon flashed in the pale sunlight as she defended the other freed prisoners, her movements displaying a level of training that could only have come from the finest military instructors. "You're full of surprises," Erik panted, as he reached her side, dispatching the last of the immediate threats with a thrust that dropped his opponent to the frozen ground. "I told you I was educated in more than just diplomatic protocol," Mei Lin replied, her dark eyes bright with the exhilaration of combat and victory. Around them, the battle was winding down as the last of Gunnar's supporters either fled or surrendered. Erik's own people were beginning to assert control over the situation, but the implications of what had just occurred would take time to fully process. Gunnar's death had ended the immediate threat to Erik's leadership, but it had also created a power vacuum that would need to be filled carefully. The revelation of Mei Lin's true identity and capabilities had answered some questions while raising many others about her presence in their community and what it might mean for their future relationships with the wider world. But as Erik stood beside the woman he loved, both of them breathing hard from the exertion of combat, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond simple military victory. They had fought together, trusted each other, and emerged triumphant from a situation that could easily have destroyed them both. The improvised weapon in Mei Lin's hand caught the morning light as she cleaned the blood from its sharpened point. A simple hairpin transformed into an instrument of liberation through skill, preparation, and the courage to act when the moment demanded it. It was, Erik realized, a perfect symbol of what she represented: the transformation of the ordinary into the extraordinary through intelligence, training, and an indomitable will to survive. The aftermath of the combat brought a strange quiet to the forest clearing, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the nervous shuffling of horses as both groups tried to process what had just occurred. Gunnar's elaborate war crown lay shattered in the frost-covered dirt, where it had fallen from his head during the final moments of the fight, its broken pieces glinting like scattered promises in the pale morning light. Erik stood over his defeated opponent's body, the ceremonial sword still in his hand but no longer raised in threat. Around him, the survivors of both factions watched with the careful attention of people trying to understand how the balance of power had just shifted and what it might mean for their own futures. "The challenge is ended," Erik repeated, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Gunnar Bloodaxe is dead, killed in fair combat according to the ancient laws. His claim on my lands and people died with him." Most of Gunnar's surviving followers nodded reluctantly, understanding that Viking tradition gave them little choice but to accept the outcome of a properly witnessed single combat. But Erik could see uncertainty in their faces, questions about what would happen to them now that their leader was gone and their military venture had failed so catastrophically. "You have a choice," Erik continued, addressing the defeated warriors directly. "You can return to your homes and live in peace, or you can remain here and seek service with honorable leaders who value loyalty over conquest. But know this: any who choose the path of revenge or continued conflict will find no mercy from me or my people." It was a generous offer by Viking standards, and Erik could see some of Gunnar's men considering it seriously. The mercenaries and foreign fighters began gathering their belongings and preparing to depart, clearly having no interest in continuing a fight that no longer promised profit or plunder. But the local warriors who had followed Gunnar out of genuine loyalty or shared ambition presented a more complex problem. Some seemed genuinely relieved that the conflict was over, ready to return to their farms and families without the burden of an ongoing war. Others remained sullenly hostile, their pride wounded by the defeat of their chosen leader. Mei Lin moved among the freed captives with quiet efficiency, checking on their injuries and organizing them for the journey back to Erik's settlement. A transformation from helpless prisoner to capable leader had been so sudden, and complete, but many of the observers were still struggling to understand what they had witnessed. "She fights like a trained warrior," Bjorn observed, joining Erik. As they surveyed the scene, where did a diplomatic envoy learn to kill armed men with a hairpin? Erik found himself smiling despite the gravity of the situation. "She continues to surprise me. I suspect there are many things about Imperial Chinese education that we don't understand." But even as he spoke, Erik was thinking about the larger implications of what had just occurred. Mei Lin's martial skills, combined with her revealed diplomatic status, painted a picture of someone who had been trained for far more than simple treaty negotiations. He was beginning to realize, exactly the kind of person who could help him navigate the complex political challenges that lay ahead. The broken crown at his feet seemed to symbolize more than just Gunnar's personal defeat. It represented the shattering of old certainties, the collapse of traditional approaches to leadership and conflict that had defined his father's generation. What would replace those old ways remained to be seen, but Erik was beginning to understand that the future would require different kinds of strength than the past had demanded. "What do we do with his settlement?" Bjorn asked, voicing the practical question that would need to be answered in the coming days. "They still have nearly 100 people, including women and children, who had nothing to do with this conflict." It was exactly the kind of decision that would define Erik's leadership going forward. The traditional Viking approach would be to absorb the defeated settlement through conquest, distributing the people and property among the victors according to established hierarchies. But Erik found himself considering alternatives that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. "We offer them partnership," he decided, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "Alliance rather than conquest. They keep their homes and their dignity, but they accept my overall leadership and contribute to our common defense." Bjorn's eyebrows rose at this unconventional proposal, but before he could voice his concerns, Mei Lin approached with a suggestion that demonstrated her own understanding of the political dynamics at play. "The alliance should be sealed with ceremony," she said quietly, "something that honors their traditions while establishing the new relationship clearly. If you simply announce your decision, some will see it as weakness rather than wisdom." Erik nodded, recognizing the insight behind her suggestion. Leadership was as much about perception and symbolism as it was about practical decision-making, and the way he handled this victory would set the tone for everything that followed. "Gather the senior men from both groups," he commanded. "We'll hold a formal assembly to establish the terms of our new alliance. Let it be witnessed and recorded so that no one can claim later that agreements were made in secret or under duress." As his people began organizing the assembly, Erik found himself studying the faces of those around him, trying to gauge their reactions to his unconventional approach to victory. Some clearly approved of his merciful treatment of the defeated enemy, seeing it as evidence of strength and confidence. Others seemed uncertain, perhaps wondering if he was being naive about the realities of power and conflict. But it was Mei Lin's expression that mattered most to him, and what he saw there was approval mixed with something that might have been pride. She understood better than anyone the kind of risks he was taking, the ways in which his choices would be viewed by both allies and enemies. Her support gave him confidence that he was choosing the right path, even if it was not the easy one. The formal assembly that followed the combat became something unprecedented in Viking tradition, a negotiation between equals rather than a dictation of terms by the victorious party. Erik used his military victory as leverage to secure cooperation, but he also offered genuine benefits in return for loyalty and good faith. The freed captives were given the choice of remaining with their new communities or receiving safe passage to return to their original homes. Several chose to stay, including some who possessed valuable skills that would benefit everyone. The integration of these new community members would present challenges, but it also offered opportunities for growth and learning that had not existed. The Fordod, As the sun reached its zenith and the various groups began dispersing to their respective destinations, Erik found himself walking with Mei Lin through the quiet forest, both of them reflecting on the morning's dramatic events. "You fought well," she said simply, her words carrying layers of meaning that went beyond simple battlefield performance. "So did you," Erik replied, "though I'm beginning to think that teaching diplomacy and teaching warfare might not be as different as I once believed." Mei Lin smiled at this observation, and Erik caught a glimpse of the complex education and training that had shaped her into the remarkable woman he had come to love. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that facing them together would be far better than facing them alone. 3 months after the combat at Sword Point, the settlement had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of winter. The document that lay on Erik's table represented something entirely new in Viking society, a written charter establishing laws and principles that treated all community members as valued participants rather than property to be owned and traded. The charter itself was written in 3 languages: Norse runes, Latin characters, and the elegant Chinese script that Mei Lin had taught to several of the settlement's children. It represented not just a legal framework, but a symbol of the cultural synthesis that was slowly taking shape under Erik and Mei Lin's joint leadership. "The delegation from Denmark will arrive tomorrow," Bjorn reported, settling into his chair with the comfortable ease of someone who had found his place in the new order. "Word of our ... unusual approach to governance has spread farther than we anticipated." Erik nodded, though his attention remained focused on the broader implications of what they had built together. The alliance with Gunnar's former settlement had proven remarkably successful, with the combined communities thriving under their new cooperative structure. Trade relationships that had been impossible under the old system of constant raiding and counter-raiding were beginning to flourish, bringing prosperity that benefited everyone. "They'll want to see for themselves," Mei Lin observed from her position near the window, where she had been watching children from both settlements playing together in the courtyard below. The idea of voluntary alliance rather than conquest challenges everything most chieftains believe about power and leadership. The marriage ceremony that had united Erik and Mei Lin 6 weeks earlier had itself become a model for the kind of cultural blending that characterized their new approach to community building. Viking traditions had been honored alongside Chinese customs, creating something that belonged fully to neither culture while drawing strength from both. "Some will see opportunity," Erik replied, thinking about the various political calculations that would be driving their visitors' interest. "Others will see threat. Change always makes people nervous, especially when it appears to be working." Mei Lin's presence at his side had proven invaluable in ways that went far beyond personal happiness. Her diplomatic training and strategic thinking had helped him navigate complex negotiations with neighboring settlements, while her medical knowledge and organizational skills had improved life for everyone in their expanded community. The trade routes she had helped establish were already bringing unprecedented prosperity to the region. Chinese silk and spices flowed north along the same paths that carried Scandinavian amber and furs south, creating economic relationships that made warfare counterproductive for everyone involved. "The children are learning Chinese characters as quickly as they learn runes," Mei Lin continued, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had found meaningful work. "They don't see the different writing systems as foreign or strange to them. It's all just knowledge that might prove useful someday." Erik smiled at this observation, recognizing it as a perfect metaphor for what they were trying to accomplish. The next generation was growing up with assumptions and expectations that differed fundamentally from those of their parents. And those differences might well determine the long-term success of their experiment in cooperative governance. The success of their approach had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Several settlements that had been considering military action against their neighbors were instead opening diplomatic negotiations, exploring whether the benefits of alliance might outweigh the traditional rewards of conquest. "There's been another message from the King of Denmark," Astrid reported, entering the hall with the carefully neutral expression she wore when delivering news that might prove controversial. "He's requesting a formal audience to discuss expanding our innovations to other parts of his realm." The royal interest represented both opportunity and danger, as Erik well understood. Official recognition could provide protection and legitimacy for their experimental community, but it could also attract the kind of political attention that might ultimately prove destructive to everything they had built. "What does he want specifically?" Erik asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "He wants to understand how we've achieved such rapid economic growth while maintaining internal stability," Astrid replied. "And he wants to know whether our methods could be replicated in other regions that have been struggling with persistent conflicts." Mei Lin exchanged a meaningful glance with Erik, both of them understanding the implications of royal attention. Success brought visibility, and visibility brought challenges that would test everything they believed about their new approach to leadership and community building. "We'll receive his delegation with appropriate honors," Erik decided. "But we'll also make it clear that our success depends on voluntary participation. This isn't something that can be imposed from above. It has to grow organically from the recognition that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than conflict." As evening approached and the day's business wound down, Erik found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this unexpected place. The slave auction that had seemed like such a minor transaction had ultimately transformed not just his personal life, but his understanding of what leadership could accomplish when guided by wisdom rather than mere strength. The settlement's evening meal had become a community celebration, with families from both the original settlement and their newer allies sharing food and stories around common tables. Children who had been enemies just months ago now played together as naturally as siblings, while their parents worked side by side on projects that benefited everyone. "Do you ever regret the choices we've made?" Erik asked Mei Lin as they walked through the bustling hall, observing the social dynamics that had emerged from their unconventional approach to integration. "I regret the circumstances that brought me here," she replied, echoing words she had spoken months earlier under very different conditions. "But I cannot regret where those circumstances led. We've built something here that neither of our cultures could have created alone." The charter on Erik's table caught the firelight as they passed, its multiple scripts seeming to dance in the flickering illumination. It represented more than just laws and regulations. It embodied a vision of what human communities could become when guided by principles of mutual respect and shared prosperity. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, dusting the settlement with the promise of another long winter. But this year would be different from all the winters that had come before, marked not by the struggle for mere survival, but by the confident planning of people who had learned to see challenges as opportunities for growth and innovation. The small acts of mercy that had started this transformation continued to ripple outward in ways that none of them could have anticipated. What had begun with one Viking warrior's decision to treat a foreign slave with basic human dignity had grown into a model for how different peoples could live together in peace and prosperity. As Erik and Mei Lin settled by their fire to plan for the challenges and opportunities that tomorrow would bring, they both understood that their story was far from over. The seeds they had planted would continue to grow, influenced by choices yet to be made and guided by principles that had proven their worth through the test of practical application. The future stretched before them like an unwritten page, full of possibilities that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. And at the heart of it all was the simple recognition that love, when combined with wisdom and courage, could indeed change the world, one choice, one relationship, one community at a time. Do you ever regret the choices we've made? Erik asked Mei Lin as they walked through the bustling hall, observing the social dynamics that had emerged from their unconventional approach to integration. I regret the circumstances that brought me here, she replied, echoing words she had spoken months earlier under very different conditions. But I cannot regret where those circumstances led. We've built something here that neither of our cultures could have created alone. The charter on Erik's table caught the firelight as they passed, its multiple scripts seeming to dance in the flickering illumination. It represented more than just laws and regulations. It embodied a vision of what human communities could become when guided by principles of mutual respect and shared prosperity. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, dusting the settlement with the promise of another long winter. But this year would be different from all the winters that had come before, marked not by the struggle for mere survival, but by the confident planning of people who had learned to see challenges as opportunities for growth and innovation. The small acts of mercy that had started this transformation continued to ripple outward in ways that none of them could have anticipated. One had begun with one Viking warrior's decision to treat a foreign slave with basic human dignity had grown into a model for how different peoples could live together in peace and prosperity. As Erik and Mei Lin settled by their fire to plan for the challenges and opportunities that tomorrow would bring, they both understood that their story was far from over. The seeds they had planted would continue to grow, influenced by choices yet to be made and guided by principles that had proven their worth through the test of practical application. The future stretched before them like an unwritten page, full of possibilities that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. And at the heart of it all was the simple recognition that love, when combined with wisdom and courage, could indeed change the world one choice, one relationship, one community at a time.